So this is the second part of the journey into maths. You should have really watched the first one first, or else this video won't make anywhere near as much sense. Not that it's going to make much sense anyway, but you get the idea. So we talked about these 5 rules we can have, and some of them we haven't really applied or used yet, but we'll see how that happens in this video. So we got to a point we were talking about velocity's distance over time. Remember we said how ideally we would like this to be in a nice straight line. It's a lot easier to work with. And we worked out that one way we can convert this is to multiply, because we've divided by t on this side, we'll multiply by t, and we multiply by t on the other side. But because those two things are the same, t on the top, t on the bottom, we can ignore it. So tv time multiplied by velocity is distance. So I could write it like that if I wanted, or I can write it like that. Doesn't matter. They all mean exactly the same thing. Okay, it's just I'm writing them in different ways. 3 times 5 is 15, 5 times 3 is 15. It's the same thing. Doesn't make any difference to us whatsoever. Now it's slightly harder, excuse me, if the one that you want on your formula is on the bottom. So if I wanted time here, it's a bit trickier. You can do it, but it's a bit trickier. Usually the best thing I think is to get to this straight line. So let's just go back to our original formula. How do we get to a straight line? Well, let's just do our multiply by t again, and now we've got a straight line. Nice straight line formula. If I wanted t, I can divide that side by v and that side by v. V is on the top, v is on the bottom, so I cancel them out. So time equals distance divided by velocity. Okay, so by working through in a 2-step stage, by getting to my straight line formula first of all, it gets a bit easier, and that's the way I think to do it. Always look for that straight line first of all. It is possible to do it the other way around. I think this is a much more straightforward way. Now I'm just going to show you another way to write this out, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a second. So here we go, same formula again, velocity equals distance over time. Okay. Now one way we can write whole numbers down is by writing them as a fraction. So number 5 can be written as a fraction like that, 5 over 1. Number 17 can be written as 17 over 1. And algebraically, I could write velocity as velocity over 1. So remember one of our rules, we said multiplying or dividing by 1, you can just ignore the 1. Which is what we normally do, of course, isn't it? We don't usually write number 5 as 5 over 1, we just write it as 5. But we could do that, it's just that we're ignoring it. So on here, where I said multiply it by t, I could write the whole thing out as a fraction. I could write it as t divided by 1. Okay? Or if I wanted to, I could write both sides out. So I could say v, instead of writing it like that, I could say v times t over 1 equals d over t times t over 1. Now it starts to look really complicated and messy, but it's just exactly the same thing. It's just I've put these 1s in that usually we ignore. Now I could write it like that. Is a completely another way to write it. I could write dt over t. It's exactly the same thing. I've ignored the 1 and I've just put those two things together, dt over t. It means exactly the same thing. Okay, and I can then cancel out t on the top, t on the bottom. All I'm left with is vt equals d. Now you might say, well, what's the point of all that? That just made life even more complicated. Normally you wouldn't do that, or you wouldn't see that, but I want you to see where, you'll see why this is important in a second. Now just to show you that this formula works in other ways, let's take a classic formula, E equals mc squared. Doesn't matter what these things, energy, mass, speed, light squared, doesn't matter what they are. Let's try and rearrange them. Okay, let's try and work it out for c squared. Let's divide both sides by m on the top, m on the bottom, cancelled out. E divided by m equals c squared. Okay. What about if I wanted if I wanted m? Let's divide both sides by c squared. C squared on top, c squared on the bottom. E divided by c squared equals m. Okay, so it keeps working itself out. One that you may come across, area equals pi r squared. Pi times the radius of the circle squared. I can manipulate it the same way. I can divide that side by pi and that side by pi, pi on the top, pi on the bottom. A divided by pi equals r squared. Let's write out again. Area equals pi r squared. This time I'm going to divide both sides by r squared. Divide r squared on top, r squared on the bottom, get rid of them. A divided by r squared equals pi. So as soon as it's a straight line, it's dead easy, okay? If it's not a straight line, simply multiply by your number on the bottom. Multiply it up to get rid of them and it'll become a straight line, and then everything else is straightforward. It doesn't matter if you get it wrong, the wrong one first of all, because they're all related, they all come together. Now, the whole point of doing this rather than those little triangles is because you are going to come across formulas that have got more than 3 things in them. So I'll try and work through an example of that with you. We'll take one from physics first of all. Now, it doesn't actually matter what these things are, okay? Just in case you're wondering, it's a formula for working out the force between two masses, okay? It could be like the Earth, m1, and the Moon, m2, okay? R squared is the distance, g is a number that helps you work out the force, okay? It doesn't matter. We're just going to do exactly the same things we did before. It looks worse because there's a lot more things in there, but it's the same idea. Excuse me. Just to be awkward, we'll pick one right from the middle. We're going to pick m1. Okay, so I'm going to write the formula out as m1 equals. So how do we go about it? Right, well, let's go step by step. First, let's get it into a straight line. It's not a straight line at the moment, so let's multiply both sides by r squared. Remember, I could write it like that if I wanted to, but I don't have to. I'll just write it all out just to show you that it's actually the same thing, okay? I ignore the ones. R squared on top, R squared on bottom. So now my new formula is this: R squared times F equals G M1 M2. Okay, now I've got it in a straight line. Let's take some more bits out. Let's get rid of the G. I'm going to divide everything on this side by G, divide everything on that side by G. G on the top, G on the bottom. Fine. So my next formula now looks like this. Okay. Now I said I wanted M1, fine. So can I divide this side by M2? Yes, I can. Divide that side by M2. M2 on top, M2 on bottom, fine. Get rid of but now I've got a problem. How do I do this? Because I've got this has already got a divide on that side. How do I divide that again? Can I just put a line under and write divide? No, I can't. But here's the interesting trick. Remember from one of our rules on the first video, multiplying and dividing are opposites of each other. Okay, and also remember that I can write out a number as being over 1. I can write the whole number as being over 1, or a letter as being over 1. Okay. Now here's the trick. Remember we multiplied fractions. Because multiplication and division of fractions are opposites of each other, because multiplying and dividing are opposites of each other, the trick is, instead of dividing each side, I'm going to multiply. Now watch this. Here's my original, let's just go back to this formula. And I said, right, I'm going to divide this side by M2. And I wrote it out like that. I could write it like that. I could say divided by M2 over 1. Okay? I could do it like that. Which means on this side, I could also write out like that. Okay, now it's starting to look quite complicated. Okay, but here's the trick, and it's this bit. Instead of dividing by M2 over 1, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to multiply it, but because it's the opposite, I have to flip that over, which is called a reciprocal. Okay, so instead of dividing by, I'm going to multiply by, but I flip it upside down, like that. Okay? I could do the same thing on this side. In fact, if I was going to write it all out like that, I'm going to put that over 1. Again, we can ignore that 1 in a second, and I'm going to divide it by 1. So multiply it by 1 over m2. Okay, now this is actually the same as what I've written up here. If I actually do the if I do the maths of it, I've got m2 on top and m2 on the bottom. Okay, m1 times 1 is m1, and 1 on the bottom, again, we can just ignore 1s. We don't need to worry about them. Okay, over here I've now got r2f times 1, I'll ignore my 1s, g times m2. So my formula now becomes r2f over g m2 equals m2. Okay, so now I've sorry, mass 1. Okay, does that make sense? Well, I don't know why I'm asking you can't really answer, can you? But that's what I've done. Now when you get used to this, you can kind of skip this phase and go, well, instead of at this bit here where you think, well, I've got to divide it by m2, you'll just get used to going, you know what, I'll just stick m2 on the bottom there and multiply it, and that's the kind of shortcut. But I want you to show you why it works out that way. Okay, so it only becomes a problem when you're dividing something that's already been divided. That's when you flip the fraction round and it becomes a reciprocal. I'll give you one more example. This is something called the ideal gas law. Don't worry what these things are. In fact, I'm not even going to tell you what they are. Doesn't matter. Let's say I need to work this out and find out what T is. How do I do it? I go through all the steps I went through before. Let's divide this side by R, and all of that side by R on the top, R on the bottom. So now I've got PV divided by R, excuse me, equals NT. Okay, can I get rid of the N on this side? Yes, I divide by N on this side, get rid of them. How do I divide by N on that side? I flip it the other way around and multiply it. So instead of it being N over 1, PV divided by R, divided by N over 1, I'm going to flip the whole thing around, I'm going to put it on this side so it doesn't matter, and it becomes that. Okay, that's the tricky step, I think, remembering that multiplying and dividing are opposites. That's what I've done. So I can now write that out as PV over NR equals T. Best advice I can give you for this stuff is just practice these things. Find a formula, write it out, and just see if you can manipulate it and turn it around. There's plenty of things on the internet which will show you the answers for this, so you can check your own answers. But it's just getting used to it and believing that it'll work. Make sure if you can get it into a straight line, it's dead easy. The problem comes when you've got to divide by something. You've got to remember to flip it round and remember those little rules there. But it does work. Stick with it.